The hearing chamber was already suffocating before Donald Trump spoke, not from heat, but from the restless current of expectation that ran through every row, every pair of folded hands, every fixed gaze. It was the kind of tension that makes a room feel smaller than it is, as though the walls have leaned in to hear what's about to be said. The cameras had been rolling for nearly an hour. Spotlights hung like unblinking eyes over the witness table, bleaching the air in a cold white glare. The long, polished table in front of the dais gleamed under it, stacked with folders and reports, all neat, all meaningless in the face of what was coming. Jasmine Crockett sat at the far end of the panel, her posture deliberate, upright, shoulders square, eyes lowered to her papers. She didn't need to look at Trump yet. She could feel his presence like a pressure on the side of her face. She had learned in courtrooms and committee rooms alike that silence and stillness could be more unnerving than any interruption. When his turn to speak came, he leaned into the microphone, one hand resting on the table, the other drifting up in a small, dismissive wave before settling again. The smirk started before the words did. "Some people here," he began, the vowels drawn out just enough to feel personal, "don't know the first thing about sacrifice, never served, never stood for this country, just here for attention." The words landed with a blunt, heavy force. No name was spoken, but every head, even those trying not to, turned toward Crockett. The air thickened. Two veterans seated in the front row shifted uncomfortably, the rustle of their jackets loud in the unnatural quiet. One of them, a man in his 60s with a silver crew cut, exhaled sharply through his nose. Trump sat back slightly, satisfied with the ripple he had set in motion. The look he cast across the dais was not one of curiosity or inquiry, but challenge, the kind of glance meant to provoke. His fingers drummed twice against the tabletop before going still. Crockett's gaze remained fixed on her notes, the faintest hint of a smile tugging at the corner of her mouth. Not amusement, but the controlled smile of someone who has just watched their opponent step neatly into a trap they didn't know was there. Her left hand moved to adjust her microphone, slow and steady, while her right slid a pen across the page, underlining something she already knew by heart. She didn't speak, not yet. Trump looked away, his attention drawn to a sympathetic member of the panel, offering a nod and half-smile as if to say, "Did you see what I just did?" The seconds began to stretch. 1, 2, 3. Her head lifted, eyes finding his across the wide table. 4, 5, 6. He met her stare, still wearing the practiced air of untouchable confidence. 7, 8, 9. Somewhere near the back of the room, a chair squeaked. 10, 11, 12. The veterans in the gallery seemed to lean forward without realizing it. 13, 14. Her smile faded. 15, 16, 17. The faint hum of the air conditioning seemed louder now. 18, 19, 20. Trump's smirk faltered, almost imperceptibly. 21, 22. She drew in a breath. 23, 24, 25. The pen stopped moving. 26, 27, 28. Her hand slid from the papers and rested flat on the table. 29. Her voice cut into the stillness like the first crack of thunder before a storm. "Mr. Trump." What followed would not be a rebuttal. It would be an unspooling, a pulling back of history's curtain to expose the hollow scaffolding behind his words, the man who had dared question her commitment to those who had worn the uniform. And when it was done, the room would not remember the smirk, Hay would remember the silence that came after. Outside the Rayburn House office building, the August heat pressed down on the crowd like a heavy hand. Veterans had begun gathering before sunrise, some in faded ball caps embroidered with unit insignias, others in plain clothes with medals pinned stubbornly to their chests. They stood shoulder to shoulder with advocates clutching clipboards and homemade signs. "Honor their service. Health care is a promise, not a gift. We fought, you fund." The media vans had claimed their spots early, antennas stabbing skyward, camera crews pacing in the shade of the sycamores. Reporters rehearsed their live hits in hushed voices, each waiting for the moment they could break whatever soundbite emerged from inside. Inside the hearing chamber, the air was cooler but no less charged. The VA Oversight Committee was supposed to be combing through line items, millions earmarked for rehabilitation programs, mental health services, rural outreach. But these hearings had never been about spreadsheets alone. They were about who could stand in front of the cameras afterward and claim the mantle of the veterans' champion. Trump had arrived with his usual entourage, aides, security, a handful of loyalists in matching ties. The moment he walked through the double doors, the gallery split into two distinct currents, applause from a pocket of supporters, sharp enough to draw a gavel tap from the chair, and a wave of murmurs from those less inclined to cheer. Jasmine Crockett had entered earlier, quietly, slipping into her seat without fanfare. Her team had prepped her with briefing binders, but she needed none of them for this exchange. She knew the veterans' issues in her district down to the dollar and the heartbreak. She'd spent hours in cramped living rooms listening to war stories that never made it into history books, stories about botched surgeries at VA hospitals, about sleepless nights haunted by things no one wanted to name. From the raised dais, she could see the veterans section clearly. Third row, center. A man with a cane leaning against his knee, staring straight ahead. To his left, a woman with silver hair in a neat braid, her fingers laced tightly around the brim of a Marine Corps cap. Crockett had spoken with both of them before. She knew their stories, and she knew they would not appreciate hearing their sacrifices used as a rhetorical weapon. The chair had tried to keep the proceedings orderly, but Trump's remarks had shifted the tone in an instant. What had been a tense but procedural morning now felt like the start of a bout. Crockett, ever aware of the optics, kept her face composed. The camera crews outside were hungry for conflict, and she would not feed them a messy brawl. She would give them something cleaner, sharper, a moment that could not be edited down to noise. At her left, an aide leaned forward and whispered, "He's baiting you." Without looking away from the papers in front of her, she murmured, "Then let him." The chair cleared his throat and called for the next question. Crockett's fingers brushed the edge of her folder, feeling the weight of the documents inside. Dates, diagnoses, public records she could recite in her sleep. She didn't need to check them. This was not about proving she was unafraid. It was about proving he had no ground to stand on. The veterans in the gallery shifted again as she reached for her microphone. The outside noise, the chanting, the horns, the press chatter, seemed to fade beneath the steady hum of the air conditioning. She was about to start, and when she did, there would be no mistaking the difference between posturing and truth. Trump's nameplate caught the light as he adjusted his seat, the faint metallic gleam drawing the cameras to him like moths. He had been in enough hearings to know that the first words mattered more than the last. They set the tempo, framed the headlines, and today he had no intention of playing defense. He leaned into the microphone, fingers drumming lightly against the mahogany tabletop. "First, let me say," he began, his voice steady, almost conversational, "I've done more for veterans than probably anybody in this room, in history really." The chair shifted in his seat but didn't interrupt. Trump launched into his familiar rhythm, part boast, part grievance, part anecdote. He spoke of VA choice, of firing bad actors in the system, of rally crowds where veterans had thanked him personally. He named cities, dates, bills. The words came out in a rolling cadence, the kind designed for cameras rather than committee notes. "You know," he said, lowering his voice just slightly, "the veterans, they love me. We've taken care of them, more than anyone thought possible. Before me, it was a disaster." He paused for effect, letting the claims settle over the room. Cameras clicked in the back row. "And yet," he continued, "you've got people here who've never served, never risked a thing, trying to tell me how to support our veterans. They talk big, but when it comes to real sacrifice, they wouldn't know it if it stood right in front of them." The statement wasn't a bullet. It was a knife, slid across the table without names, but aimed with precision. The silence that followed was as deliberate as the smirk curling at the edge of his mouth. Crockett didn't move. Her pen tapped once against the margin of her notes, then stilled. She had heard the pivot coming, the slow narrowing from policy to personal. The veterans in the gallery shifted again, restless, A man in a dark blazer crossed his arms, jaw tightening. Trump glanced sideways, eyes sweeping the panel. He let his gaze linger on Crockett for a beat longer than the others, enough for the audience to feel the weight of the stare without him needing to say her name. It was theater, and he knew his audience. "You've got some people here," he said, "who've been in Washington for 5 minutes and think they're experts. Experts in sacrifice, experts in service. Well, I'm sorry, but it doesn't work that way. You earn that right." The chair cleared his throat, but the gavel stayed down. This wasn't procedural misconduct, not technically. It was bait, carefully wrapped in the language of opinion. Crockett's eyes rose from her papers, steady and unblinking. She didn't return the smirk. She didn't frown. She simply met his gaze with the kind of stillness that makes the other person want to look away first. Trump didn't. Not yet. At the far end of the gallery, a reporter typed rapidly, mouthing the words as they appeared on his screen. The clip would be online before the hour was over, but Crockett wasn't thinking about that. She was thinking about timing, how the most effective blows aren't thrown in the first exchange, but in the one your opponent doesn't see coming. The chair finally nodded toward her. "Representative Crockett, you have the floor." She drew in a breath, fingertips resting lightly on the microphone. The veterans in the room leaned forward. Even Trump shifted, just enough to betray anticipation. Her first question would sound like an olive branch, but beneath it was the hook, and she knew once it was set, he would pull against it himself. Crockett's fingers hovered over the microphone switch, her expression unreadable. Years in law and politics had taught her that the first weapon in any confrontation wasn't a sharp tongue. It was patience. She glanced briefly at the chair, then back down at her papers, as though she needed to check something before speaking. It was a deliberate pause, one long enough for the air in the room to shift. Silence could be as loud as an accusation if you held it long enough. "Thank you, Mr. Chair," she began, her tone measured, almost cordial. She didn't look at Trump immediately. Instead, she addressed the gallery, as if to ground her words in the presence of the veterans watching. "We are here to talk about the lives and dignity of men and women who have worn the uniform of this country. That's what this hearing is for." She turned a page with the care of someone handling a fragile document. In truth, she could recite the contents without looking, the dates, the deferments, the testimonies, but the movement gave her the appearance of calm review. She wanted the contrast to be obvious, his bluster, her composure. Trump leaned back in his chair, eyes narrowing slightly, like a man trying to decide if the other player in the game had just moved a piece or was simply touching it. Crockett let her gaze drift to him at last, just for a moment. "Now, I've listened closely to your remarks," she said, voice even, "and I appreciate your perspective on sacrifice." The phrasing was careful, almost deferential, but those who knew her cadence could hear the steel beneath. Trump gave a small nod, as if conceding that point to her. "And I agree," she continued, "that sacrifice is not just a word we use in passing. It's lived, it's embodied, it's often invisible to those who haven't experienced it." She let that hang, her eyes scanning the veterans in the front row. A few nodded subtly in return. Her right hand, resting on the edge of the folder, traced a faint line along the tab, a movement so small most wouldn't notice. Inside were the records she had no need to reference: selective service notices, medical deferment paperwork, newspaper interviews, public record. Facts that had been sitting in plain sight for decades but rarely spoken directly in the same breath as his name in a hearing room. She knew that if she revealed them too soon, the impact would dissolve into argument. No, the truth had to come as a response, not an opening. Trump shifted again, this time leaning forward, elbows on the table. "Are you going to ask a question, or are we just getting a speech?" His voice carried a thin edge of impatience. Crockett didn't look at him immediately. She picked up her pen and made a slow, deliberate note in the margin of her papers. Then, in the same measured tone, she said, "I will, Mr. Trump. And when I do, I want to make sure we both understand exactly what sacrifice means to this discussion." For the first time, the smirk that had been hanging at the corner of his mouth faded, just a fraction. The chair's eyes flicked between them, sensing the tightening coil of what was to come. In the gallery, a photographer adjusted his lens, leaning in for the shot. Crockett glanced at the clock above the chamber doors. She wasn't stalling, she was counting. Timing was as much a weapon as the truth itself, and she was about to wield both. Crockett's pen came to rest on the paper, the ink dot blooming slightly where it paused. She lifted her eyes, locking them on Trump with a steadiness that didn't waver. The veterans in the front row shifted again. They could feel it. The air had the weight of an incoming storm. "Mr. Trump," she began, her voice clear but unhurried. "You've spoken about sacrifice, about putting the country first. I'd like to understand something for the record." Trump tilted his head, his expression somewhere between guarded curiosity and impatience. "Go ahead," he said. She folded her hands, fingers interlaced. "In your view, does sacrifice, real sacrifice, require military service?" The question seemed simple enough, almost naive. The kind of question you could swat away with a rehearsed answer, and that's exactly what she wanted him to think. Trump leaned back slightly. "Well," he said, dragging, I think it means a lot of things. Service, yes, but not just in the military. It's about putting the country ahead of yourself. Some people don't do that." He didn't know it yet, but he'd taken the first step into her snare. "I see," she replied, nodding slowly as though weighing his words. "So in your estimation, military service is one of the purest forms of sacrifice?" "Of course," Trump said, his tone firm now. "You're putting your life on the line. That's the ultimate, and I respect it more than anything." In the gallery, a man in a navy cap leaned forward, elbows resting on his knees. A reporter's fingers hovered over their keyboard, sensing the shift. Crockett's voice softened, but her words sharpened. "Then perhaps," she said, "you could help me reconcile something." Trump's chin lifted a fraction. "What's that?" She reached for the folder in front of her, sliding it closer. The papers made the faintest rasp against the polished wood. She didn't open it yet, just let it rest there, visible but untouched. "I've reviewed the public record," she continued, "and I noticed that during the Vietnam War you received multiple deferments from service, 4 for education and 1 for a medical condition. Bone spurs, I believe." A murmur rippled through the gallery. The veterans section went still. Cameras zoomed in on Trump's face. She kept her tone neutral, almost academic. "These records are not in dispute. They're part of the Selective Service Archive, so I'd like to ask, how do you reconcile receiving those deferments with questioning the sacrifice of others?" Trump blinked once, then shifted in his chair. "That's old news," he said quickly. "Everyone knows about that. It was legitimate. Doctors said—" She raised a hand slightly, not enough to interrupt, but enough to signal she wasn't finished. "I'm not questioning the legality, Mr. Trump. I'm asking about the principle. You've just said that military service is the ultimate sacrifice, but when called, you declined. And now you question the commitment of others who serve veterans in different capacities." The room was silent except for the faint clicking of camera shutters. Trump's lips tightened. "I've done more for veterans than anyone." "And yet," she said, her voice now just a shade firmer, "when it was your turn, you didn't stand where they stood." The chair shifted in his seat, clearly aware that the exchange had left the realm of policy and stepped into personal reckoning. In the gallery, the Navy veteran's gaze didn't leave Trump. The first question had been asked, and now, every eye in the room waited for the next move. The air in the chamber felt heavy, as though the walls themselves absorbed the tension. Cameras clicked sporadically, each flash catching fragments of the tableau. Crockett's steady poise, Trump's impatient tapping fingers, the veterans in the gallery watching with rapt attention. The chair tried to smooth the proceedings back toward procedural order, but the undercurrent was undeniable. The exchange had shifted from policy to character, from debate to duel. Trump leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms, eyes narrowing into slits. "You think speeches change anything? These men and women need action, not another sermon from someone who's never been in the mud." The words hit like a hammer, but Crockett didn't flinch. She leaned into the microphone, her voice measured, almost intimate in tone, yet carrying to the back row. "And what exactly have you done for them when no one was watching, when there weren't cameras in your face?" when there wasn't a headline to be made. A murmur rippled through the audience. Not loud enough to break decorum, but sharp enough to draw the chair's gavel to the desk. The sound only seemed to add fuel to the quiet blaze building between them. "I've done more for veterans than you'll ever understand," Trump shot back, his voice rising. "Billions in funding, reforms no else could get passed. And yet," she countered, leaning closer, "we still have veterans sleeping under bridges. We still have suicide hotlines that go unanswered. If you want to measure commitment, don't measure it in press releases. Measure it in the lives actually saved." Trump's jaw tightened, but she didn't stop. "You stand here and talk about sacrifice, but sacrifice isn't a slogan. It's not something you put on a hat and sell. Sacrifice is knowing you may lose everything and showing up anyway. It's the widow who writes to this committee because her husband's PTSD treatment was denied until it was too late. It's the veteran who spends his last savings trying to get to a VA appointment because the bus line was cut. That is the America they're living in, and you want to tell me I don't understand sacrifice?" The silence after her words was deafening, not an absence of sound, but the kind of silence that demanded attention, like the hush before a storm. Somewhere in the gallery, a veteran in a faded Marine Corps jacket nodded, his lips pressing into a thin, approving line. The chair cleared their throat, attempting to pivot the hearing back to the agenda, but the moment had already cemented itself. This wasn't just about funding anymore. It was about who owned the moral ground they stood on. The chair's gavel struck once, twice, sharp cracks against the wood, but the energy in the chamber was no longer under anyone's control. The moment had gone beyond procedure. From the gallery, phones were already lifted discreetly, recording snippets that would no doubt flood social media before the session even adjourned. Every lens seemed trained on the gap between Trump and Crockett, two figures separated by a few feet, but worlds apart in conviction. Trump leaned forward this time, elbows planted on the desk, his voice dripping with disdain. "You love to play hero, don't you? Standing here, pretending you're the voice of veterans. But where were you when the real work was being done? Oh, right. Chasing headlines and votes." Crockett's eyes didn't waver. She reached into her folder, a deliberate slow motion that made the entire room instinctively lean forward. Out came a single sheet of paper, clipped to a photograph. "You want to talk about real work?" she said quietly, her words cutting more than if she'd shouted. "Let's talk about this." She slid the photo across the table toward him. Trump glanced down, and for a fraction of a second, the mask slipped. His eyes flickered in recognition. On the big monitor behind the committee, the image lit up for everyone to see. A crumbling VA facility, paint peeling from the walls, a broken elevator shaft wrapped in yellow caution tape. The timestamp in the corner showed the photo was taken during his administration. In the same month, a federal grant for repairs had been quietly reallocated to a public relations initiative. A low, shocked murmur rolled through the room like a slow wave. Trump's voice came back quick, defensive. "That's out of context." Crockett cut in, her tone razor-sharp. "The context is in the receipts, sir, which I have right here." She tapped the stack of documents in front of her, the crisp sound echoing in the chamber. The veterans in the gallery were no longer just watching. They were leaning forward, eyes locked, waiting to hear every word. Somewhere in the press row, a reporter mouthed to another, "This is it." The chamber was so still you could hear the faint hum of the overhead lights. Crockett didn't rush. She knew the slower she moved, the heavier the weight of each word. She adjusted the microphone and picked up the first page from the stack, a printed internal memo marked confidential. "Dated May 14, 2019, she began, her voice steady but laced with controlled fire. "This document, authored by a senior official in your administration, explicitly states that $4.2 million earmarked for VA facility repairs was reallocated, quote, to enhance the public image of the administration's commitment to veterans affairs." The words public image seemed to sting more than any insult. Trump shifted in his seat, his jaw tightening. "We did more for veterans than any president in—" "You did more for your image than for the men and women who served this country," Crockett shot back, not even giving him the full second to finish. Gasps came from the gallery. A veteran in a wheelchair clenched his fist in his lap, not in anger at her, but in raw, unfiltered recognition of the truth. Crockett picked up the second page, holding it high enough for the press cameras to get a clean shot. Here we have the follow-up directive, dated June 3, 2019. It orders the delay of critical maintenance at 8 VA hospitals. One of those hospitals is in my district. The delay led to a malfunctioning elevator that left 2 wheelchair-bound veterans unable to reach their medical appointments for weeks. Trump waved his hand dismissively. You're twisting this. Am I? She turned toward the monitor. Let's let the room decide. With a nod to the tech operator, the big screen flickered, now showing photographs of those very veterans in the hospital hallway, stuck between floors, their faces a mix of frustration and quiet humiliation. The gallery erupted, not in applause, but in a sharp, collective murmur that was impossible to ignore. Crockett didn't flinch. This isn't politics, Mr. Trump. This is the cost of your decisions, and unlike you, I can look them in the eye while I say it. Trump's lips pressed into a thin, bloodless line. Every journalist in the room knew what they was seeing, the precise moment when a controlled hearing had turned into a national reckoning. Trump leaned forward, gripping the edges of the table like a man about to steady himself in a storm. His voice rose, carrying that signature mix of bravado and indignation. You know, Jasmine, I've dealt with plenty of people like you. Loud, flashy, always looking for the spotlight. You're not here for veterans. You're here for yourself. Just a blogger in a suit. The words hung in the air. The insult landed, but not in the way he'd hoped. Crockett's brow arched slightly, as though she'd just been handed an unexpected gift. She let the pause linger, a calculated silence that forced the room to lean in. Then, calmly, almost conversationally, she said, Mr. Trump, if being just a blogger means documenting the truth you want buried, exposing the receipts you'd rather shred, and speaking up when the powerful fail the powerless, then yes, I am exactly that, and it's why I'm here, and why you're under oath. The chamber crackled. A single laugh, sharp and disbelieving, broke from someone in the press row, quickly swallowed by the weight of the moment. Trump tried to interrupt, but she pressed forward. You've spent your career building towers out of other people's money and walls out of other people's pain. I build something else, accountability, and you can't bulldoze that. The veteran in the front row, the one in the wheelchair, began clapping, slowly at first, then joined by scattered applause from the gallery, despite the chair's attempts to restore order. The cameras zoomed in on Trump's face, a flash of irritation, a flicker of calculation, and then, that tight, familiar smile that meant he was hiding the sting. Crockett simply turned back to her stack of papers, as if to say, we're not even halfway done. The room's energy shifted. No longer just a clash of personalities, but the tightening of a noose woven from paper trails and sworn testimony. Crockett slid a manila folder across the table toward the clerk. For the record, this contains copies of contracts, wire transfers, and email correspondence between the Trump Veterans Initiative and 3 shell corporations registered in Delaware. Trump's eyes narrowed. Shell corporations? That's nonsense. Crockett didn't flinch. One of them, Liberty Forward LLC, lists as its sole officer a Mr. Randall Keene, a man who coincidentally was on your campaign payroll in 2020. Another, Horizon Valor Partners, was incorporated just 4 weeks before it received a $1.2 million consulting fee from the initiative. And the third, Patriot Outreach Solutions, appears to exist solely to reroute donations into private accounts that paid for, among other things, an $89,000 ballroom renovation at Mar-a-Lago. A ripple of murmurs coursed through the gallery. The press section was scribbling furiously. Trump leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms, forcing a smirk. Typical political witch hunt. You're trying to make normal business sound shady. Crockett's gaze was cool, surgical. Mr. Trump, the normal business you're describing drained over $3 million from a veterans' housing project in Ohio, a project that stalled halfway through construction, leaving 22 former service members in limbo, and every paper in this file. She tapped the folder with her index finger. Has your name, or the name of someone in your direct orbit, on the authorization line. The veteran in the front row shifted uncomfortably, his jaw tightening, his hands, resting on the wheels of his chair, clenched. Trump's attorney leaned in to whisper something in his ear, but the microphones caught Trump's response. "Let her keep talking, she's digging her own grave." Crockett heard it. She smiled faintly, not looking up from her papers. "On the contrary, Mr. Trump," she said, "I'm building the foundation, and this house has more rooms than you think." The gavel came down, calling for order, but it was already too late. The scent of blood was in the air. The courtroom doors creaked open, drawing every eye. A tall, broad-shouldered man in a pressed navy suit walked in, his face pale but resolute. The faint glint of military service pins caught the overhead lights as he approached the witness stand. The bailiff swore him in, and the man's voice carried the weight of someone who had spent years giving orders and having them obeyed. "State your name for the record." "Major Alan Whitaker, United States Marine Corps, retired." A hush settled. Trump's smirk faltered, just slightly, as recognition flickered across his face. Crockett stepped forward, her tone measured. "Major Whitaker, you oversaw the Veterans Housing Project in Dayton, Ohio, correct?" "Yes, ma'am. I was brought on to coordinate between the contractors, the nonprofit, and the initiative funding the project." "And did that project receive all the funding it was promised?" The major's jaw tightened. "No, we were approved for $5.6 million. We received less than half before the money stopped coming. After that, supplies ran out. Workers walked off the site. The veterans, some in wheelchairs, some dealing with PTSD, were told to find alternate arrangements." "Did you investigate where the missing funds went?" Crockett asked. "Yes, I followed the paper trail. It led to those shell corporations you mentioned earlier. And from there, to a bank account in Florida." The air in the room thickened. "Can you tell the court whose name was on that account?" Whitaker didn't blink. "Donald J. Trump." The gallery erupted. Reporters' phones lit up like fireworks, capturing every flicker of Trump's reaction. Trump slammed a hand on the table. "That's a damn lie." Judge Martin's gavel cracked through the uproar. "Order! Order in this court." Crockett, unshaken, turned back to the witness. "Major, do you have documented proof of this transaction?" "Yes, ma'am. I brought certified copies with me today." From his briefcase, Whitaker produced a neatly bound packet. The bailiff delivered it to the judge, who began leafing through the pages, his brow furrowing deeper with each turn. Trump's attorney shifted uncomfortably, whispering into his client's ear, but Trump's eyes never left Whitaker, the kind of stare that promised retribution. Crockett let the silence build, the weight of the evidence hanging over the room. "Major Whitaker," she said finally, "thank you for your service, both to this country and to the truth." The judge had barely finished reviewing Whitaker's documents when Trump shot to his feet. "Your Honor, this is outrageous. This so-called witness is part of a political hit job. He's lying under oath. Everyone knows he's been promised a job in the Biden administration." Gasps and murmurs rippled through the gallery. Crockett didn't move. She simply folded her arms, letting Trump's voice boom and echo until Judge Martin finally spoke. "Mr. Trump, sit down. You will have your opportunity to question the witness during cross-examination." But Trump wasn't done. "No, I'm not going to sit here while this kangaroo court—" "Mr. Trump!" The judge's gavel cracked like thunder. "One more interruption like that and you'll be held in contempt." Slowly, Trump sat, though the anger burning in his eyes made it clear this was far from over. Crockett stepped toward the center of the room, her voice calm but carrying an edge like a drawn blade. "Your Honor, I'd like to address the defendant's claim right now." The judge gave a curt nod. "Mr. Trump accuses Major Whitaker of political bias, but facts don't have a party affiliation. Either the funds for the Veterans Housing Project were stolen or they weren't. The documents show exactly where they went, and unless the bank account in Florida spontaneously opened it, Mr. Trump has some explaining to do." She let the words hang in the air. The jury shifted in their seats. One man in the back scribbled notes furiously. Trump's attorney stood for cross. "Major Whitaker, did you personally see my client withdraw this alleged money?" "No, sir," Whitaker said firmly. "I saw the certified banking records. I traced the corporate transactions, and I filed the report myself. If you're asking whether I stood over his shoulder at the ATM, no, but the trail is clear. The attorney tried to press, but Whitaker didn't waver. Crockett leaned in, voice like steel. Major, in your military career, did you ever lose track of funds entrusted to you? Never. And if you had, what would have happened? I'd have been court-martialed. Crockett turned to the jury. And yet, here we are. The words landed like a hammer. Trump muttered something under his breath, and the court reporter stopped typing. I'm sorry, could you repeat that, Mr. Trump? I said, Trump started, but his lawyer gripped his arm tightly. Crockett didn't hide her smirk. Nothing to add? Good. Because the documents speak louder than your insults. The courtroom was still buzzing from Whitaker's testimony when Crockett stepped forward again, a slim folder in her hands. Your Honor, she began, before we move to recess, the prosecution would like to call one final witness for the day. Trump's attorney immediately objected. We weren't informed of any additional witnesses. That's because this one only came forward last night, Crockett said, her tone smooth but carrying a dangerous undercurrent. And given the relevance to the funds in question, we're asking the court to make an exception. Judge Martin leaned forward, curiosity flickering in his eyes. Name? Crockett smiled faintly. Rebecca Lynn, Senior Account Manager at Sunbank International. The name seemed to hit Tree, like a punch. His expression froze, then hardened. From the gallery, a woman in her late 30s walked forward, black blazer, crisp white blouse, her posture as straight as a ruler. She didn't look nervous. She looked determined. After being sworn in, Crockett approached her with deliberate calm. Ms. Lynn, can you tell the court your role at Sunbank International? I manage high net worth accounts, both domestic and offshore. And do you recognize this account number? Crockett handed her a document. Lynn barely glanced at it before answering. Yes, it's a holding account under the name Palmetto Trading Group, registered in the Cayman Islands. And who controls that account? Lynn didn't hesitate. Donald J. Trump. The air left the room in an audible wave. Trump's lawyer shot up. Objection. We don't have proof of... Crockett's voice cut him off. Your Honor, the witness has brought certified bank statements, including signature verification, wire transfer logs, and internal memos, all tying the missing veteran's funds to this offshore account. Lynn slid a stack of papers across to the clerk. Crockett turned to the jury. Ladies and gentlemen, the defendant claims he knows nothing about these missing funds, yet here's his signature, his authorization codes, and the precise routing of the money, step by step, from a veterans housing project to a Cayman shell company. Trump's knuckles whitened against the table. His attorney whispered urgently in his ear, but Trump shook his head, glaring at Lynn as if trying to burn a hole through her. Crockett stepped back, voice quiet but lethal. You can try to shout down a soldier, Mr. Trump. You can smear an investigator, but paper doesn't scare, and paper doesn't lie. The judge's gavel struck twice, but the tension in the courtroom didn't ease. Trump was hunched forward now, staring at the stack of bank statements on the clerk's desk like they were ticking explosives. His J-tin worked furiously, the tendons in his neck taut. Mr. Trump, Judge Martin warned, you will refrain from speaking out of turn. But Trump couldn't hold it in. He slammed both palms on the table, the sound cracking through the room like a gunshot. This is a witch hunt, he barked, his voice echoing off the marble walls. That woman, he jabbed a finger at Crockett, has been plotting against me since day one. And you, now at Lynn, you're a liar, a paid liar. Gasps rippled through the spectators. Crockett didn't flinch. She simply folded her arms, her gaze steady. Mr. Trump, the jury heard the documents. They don't need your tantrum to make up their minds. Trump's lawyer was on his feet, murmuring frantically into his client's ear, but Trump shoved him back into his seat. No, they're going to hear the truth. You want to talk about offshore accounts? What about her donors? What about the Democrats hiding money in... Mr. Trump! Judge Martin's voice boomed. One more outburst, and you will be held in contempt of court. The room went still except for the scribbling of the court reporter's pen. Trump sank back into his chair, but his eyes stayed locked on Crockett, full of venom. His breathing was heavy, like a man holding back a flood. Crockett, sensing the shift in the air, turned to the jury. "Ladies and gentlemen, I want you to remember what you just witnessed. This isn't the behavior of someone calmly disproving a lie. This is the reaction of a man cornered by the truth." The judge finally called for a recess, but no one moved right away. Even as the gavel fell, all eyes stayed on the defendant, whose glare made it clear this wasn't over.